The final KBNS public lecture. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Jonathan Ichikawa from the University of British Columbia. He's going to talk about skepticism, rape culture, and oppression. Thank you, Jonathan.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks for being here. I recognize, of course, many of you from the event that's been going the past few days, so I applaud your stamina. Thanks for still being here. I would also just like to invite you to recalibrate your audience engagement mode. So this is a KBNS public lecture. So it's part of our kind of outreach program. So I'll be talking about issues that I think are epistemologically interesting, that I hope that you will agree with me are epistemologically interesting. I will be doing so in a way that I hope doesn't kind of presuppose, in a strong sense, familiarity, any particular expertise with philosophy. That might mean for some of you who have been around a little while, I'll be explaining a few more things from the first steps than you're used to. Might also mean that some of the arguments go a little faster and are a little breezier with some of the details than you might like. I hope I don't say I'm not planning on saying anything that I think is actually false. But I do plan to kind of skim over some of the details in ways I'm happy to talk about later if we come up. But I'd like to kind of try and remain focused on the big picture. So one thing that I'd like to just mention right at the outset, you won't be surprised, just given the title of my talk, but I will be talking about sexual assaults. I won't be doing so in any kind of like graphic detail. What I'm really interested in are the sorts of structural features of society that make responding to sexual assault particularly difficult. So I'm thinking about like the upshot, the way that testimony gets received, issues like that. But do expect me to be spending some time discussing some case studies in that area, particularly kind of in the second half here. So here's kind of my general outline. I'll give you a version of this so you can see the whole thing bright before I get into it. So here's generally where I'm going. What I'd like to emphasize are some of the respects that can sometimes get overlooked, and I would just like to encourage us not to overlook, in which epistemology is practical. Practical not just in our kind of, in the sense of practical reasoning, like, you're doing good syllogisms, but, the hard questions about how to organize a society, about how to live, how to respond to difficult situations, are kind of riddled through with epistemological considerations, in a way that I think actually is quite continuous with the relatively abstract epistemology that a lot of people spend most of their time focusing on when they're studying epistemology. But we sometimes, we don't always emphasize those points of continuity, so I'd like to spend some time emphasizing those points of continuity today. This has to do particularly with like what kinds of thought experiments we think about. They're brains and bats, but they're also much more quotidian cases that are important to consider. So I'll spend some time talking there. Sections 1 and 2, if you've been around epistemology a little while, will be like, not super new, I think. I'll be saying things hopefully from an interesting angle, but I don't expect to blow anybody's mind in those first 2 bits if they've been around epistemology for a little while. But in sections 3, 4, and 5, I'd like to say some things that I think are a little bit more controversial, maybe a little bit more generally interesting. And these have to do with the relationship between certain tropes in epistemology, in particular skeptical tropes, and specific cultural forces, in particular conservative forces that reinforce the status quo, particularly oppressive elements of the status quo. So the big picture is to draw a line from skeptical considerations to structural oppression, and to think about how some of the kinds of cases that we think about in our epistemology courses bear on these structural issues. Rape culture is in the title of the talk. I didn't put rape culture specifically in this outline. As I ended up putting the details together, my focus ended up being a little bit more general. I'm talking about oppressive features of society more generally, but I will talk in some specificity about rape culture tropes, really in section 5. All right, that's the plan. Let's start, shall we, with section 1. That seems as good a place as any. And so, again, begging your forgiveness for those of you who've been around a little while, I'm going to do just a little bit of like epistemology 101. Basic stuff. In fact, I'm going to go like day 1 epistemology 1. I said I'm not going to assume familiarity. I've been talking like you know what the word epistemology means. I think some of you do, but here in a minute, like you all will. So epistemology is the branch of philosophy that has to do with questions about knowledge and reasonable belief. You know, the rough idea is some things are more reasonable to believe than other things, and epistemology is kind of the branch of philosophy that studies what that's all about. When does that happen? How does that happen? Does that happen? Different epistemologists focus on different kinds of things. Some of you, like me, are partisans in this debate. I'm the kind of epistemologist who likes to talk about knowledge. For that reason, you'll hear me talking about knowledge today. I don't think, I'll be interested if you disagree, but I don't think that like the big picture points that I'm making today depend on my kind of like knowledge emphasizing approach to epistemology. You know, lots of what I say is going to be pretty applicable for questions about reasonable belief or what the evidence supports, etc. One thing that does need to be distinguished really clearly, we're still in epistemology 101 here, is we need a clear distinction, I think, between the idea of something being true and something being known. So in the philosophical jargon, this is the difference between metaphysics and epistemology. So you know, this gets a little bit confused sometimes in the popular discourse. When you talk about like a post-fact world, people sometimes use that kind of language when they mean nobody can agree on what the facts are. Which, you know, that's fine if that's the label, but I don't think we should literally think that's in any sense post-fact. There's still facts, even if people can't agree what they are. There are even, I think, facts if not only can no one agree what they are, but in fact, like there's no way to tell who's right. There can be facts that nobody knows. When you say that like in the abstract, that sounds like very plausible. You know, I flip a coin and don't check how it lands, and then kick it so it flips some more. There's a fact about how it lands, even though like nobody knows what it was, right? You can think of epistemology as the branch of philosophy that concerns our attempt to match up our doxastic states, our beliefs, or our credences with the facts. We're trying to like make our representations of the world match the way the world really is. So, you know, traditional epistemological questions. What is it to know something? What makes it more reasonable to believe one thing rather than another thing? Is there any such thing as knowledge in light of like skeptical puzzles? I'll talk a little bit about some of them in a few minutes. All right. There's my like 3-minute epistemology 101 course. Epistemology often gets a reputation. This is less true than it used to be, but it's still somewhat true. When I was in grad school, which was like not that long ago, epistemology really did have this reputation, I think. The reputation of being like very abstract. So some people would say like, oh, you're studying epistemology, like I couldn't study epistemology because I like want to focus on things that like, you know, really matter. So that's why I'm an ethicist instead of epistemologist. Like people said that when I was in grad school. And like, I don't exactly blame them because, you know, a lot of the focus that epistemologists were putting on their epistemological questions did not emphasize the practical import of what they were doing. So, you know, if you spent some time engaged in the literature on the analysis of knowledge, which gets like very fussy and, you know, this condition can't quite be right, so I'm going to like write a more complicated version of it to get rid of this counterexample. And then you go back and forth to like increasingly baroque, far-fetched counterexamples. Like I can see why people looked at that project and said like, what's the point here? I think there is a point there. Like I'm not saying that was a true instinct, but I do agree that you know, some of these projects didn't kind of wear their importance like on their sleeves, as it were. I can give some more examples of projects that like created that impression, but that's not the impression I'm trying to cultivate here. So let's just move on. By contrast to this kind of sometimes stereotype of epistemology, I think, as I said earlier, that epistemology is extremely practical. My friends who said I want to study ethics instead of epistemology because I care about like real world decisions. I think, you know, ethics is a perfectly like important field of study. That's one way to talk about questions that are important. But I think it has like no advantage over epistemology whatsoever in that respect. So if you think about like if you're deciding what to do, like what action ought I to perform? I think like there are really two broad kinds of questions you need to think about. One is like, how do I want things to be? What would be best? and that's like kind of what ethics helps you figure out. And you also need to figure out like, what are things like, and what's going to happen if I do what? And that's like what epistemology helps you figure out what to do. And like without a good answer to both those questions, you're just never going to like do a good job doing stuff in the world. So I think epistemology is just as practical as ethics. Another way of making the point, like if you're doing stuff, you've got to be doing it like, well, you know, at least a lot of the time, if you want to be doing a good job doing stuff, you should be doing it for reasons. And if your reason like is something that you have no justification for, that's a bad situation. So this morning I went to Glasgow. There's a workshop over there. I gave another talk this morning, and so you know it wasn't that complicated, but I had to like figure out how to get to the train station and then get on the right train. And so I got on the train to platform 3. I don't think there's 6 platforms in Sterling really. So I got on the train platform 3. And that was because that's what that's where the schedule said like the train to Glasgow was going, right? But of course that move was only as good as my justification for believing that that's what the schedule said. Okay. So this is a fairly obvious point, I think, once you really spell it out. This is like a slightly theoretically weighty way of putting it. Again, I'm not really trying to lean on the distinction between knowledge and other epistemic states. When I say it really matters what we know, I mean like epistemological questions are practical. Matters what beliefs are justified, matters what you know, etc. Here are some like things that you might think that would have clear practical significance. The mushrooms around here are safe to eat. Somebody told me that, let's say. If I'm going to act on that, like am I going to go eat those mushrooms? I know that like lots of mushrooms around the world are very poisonous. I also know that like, it's pretty hard to tell the difference between safe mushrooms and poisonous mushrooms. So, I better have like a lot of evidence that my friend's really reliable to trust my friend about like it being a good idea to eat this mushroom. Political conspiracy theories. People debate like, maybe this debate's kind of finally done, but maybe not quite. People debate whether there's conclusive evidence to believe in human-caused climate change, and lots of people say it is. Lots of scientists say, yeah, there's good evidence for that. But like some people say, oh, yeah, that evidence is like not conclusive. There's still room to like be unsure about it. The question of whether there's still room to be unsure about that is a really important practical question if you're like organizing your society. Here's another example that belongs on this list. This one is weighty in different kinds of ways. Suppose that my friend tells me that our mutual friend raped her. That is that puts me in a kind of that puts me in a serious, high stakes moral situation. I now have to decide, and I really like only have 2 choices here. I have to decide: am I gonna like take my friend's word seriously, which is gonna have dramatic implications on my relationship with my other friend, or am I going to say, yeah, I hear you say that, but like I don't, I'm not gonna just take you at your word, which will have dramatic implications and effects on my friend who made this disclosure to me. So these are all just examples of situations where what you should do depends in important ways on what you should believe, what your evidence points to, what you know, etc. All right. Although philosophy often kind of epistemology often focuses on some of these like abstract questions and far off skeptical possibilities, it's important, I think, to highlight that that the whole project, I think, is motivated by like some of these kinds of considerations, motivated by the importance of these questions, practically speaking. So here's Descartes, kind of famous, kind of standard introduction to epistemology kind of material. This is the Meditations. This is Meditations 1, where he's kind of setting up his skeptical project. Descartes writes, in the voice of his meditator, "Several years have elapsed since I first became aware that I had accepted, even from my youth, many false opinions for true, and that consequently, what I afterward based on such principles was highly doubtful. And so, for that reason, I had to go do this project of making sure that my beliefs are like good. They're not like those bad ones that I noticed before. So motivated by, quotidian error, hey, I've gone wrong in my real life in the past. He's not like doing, far-flung thought experiments yet. He's going to do those real soon. But like at this point in the meditations, he's just saying, hey, here are some things that happened to me like a little while ago. I was wrong about some stuff, so I better like do epistemology now. That's a kind of natural thought. All right. So that natural thought leads us into these skeptical scenarios, and Descartes like goes quite quickly to some fairly extreme ones. So what's a skeptical scenario? Skeptical scenario is, it's roughly like a way that in some sense things could be, you could imagine things being like that. Maybe in some sense your evidence doesn't seem to rule out things being that way. And if things were that way, you'd be wrong about something. And the thought is, okay, well, if there's a way that like things might be where you'd be wrong about, whether you're sitting here listening to a public lecture right now or not. If there's a way that things could be where you're wrong about that, and you can't rule that out, well, then maybe you don't know whether you're sitting in a public lecture right now. That's a kind of like reasonably natural sort of argument once you start taking the skeptical scenarios seriously. And epistemologists kind of are happy to think about like, very elaborate, far-fetched skeptical scenarios. So Descartes, quite quickly in his meditations, starts imagining an evil demon who manipulates his senses directly. So Descartes like thinks that he exists in a physical world, like with a body, but maybe he's just a mind and there's someone who's like making him feel like he has a body, right? Or, slightly less extremely, no, much less extremely, you might be dreaming. So think again about your belief that you're attending a public lecture right now. Here's something that you could imagine. Imagine you fell asleep during Crispin's talk, and you're dreaming now about my talk. Can you tell? I mean, maybe you can, but people have been impressed by the argument. No, there's no thing. My dreams are really realistic. Maybe things would seem just that way. So maybe I don't really know whether I'm listening to Jonathan's talk right now, right? The famous brain in a vat scenario. Basically, it's kind of a like contemporary science fiction version of, not even that contemporary, but it's a 20th century science fiction version of Descartes' evil demon, right? So you don't have a body, you just have a brain, and you're sort of hooked up to a computer simulation, and you're getting your senses that way, right? Skeptical scenarios suggest arguments. I kind of suggested a version of this argument already. You think you're attending a public lecture, but can you prove that you're not? And now fill in the details of the skeptical scenario. A brain in a vat who is not in a public lecture, but just is having like computer simulation bits, like telling it that it's in a public lecture, right? If you can't prove that's not the case, I guess you don't really know whether you're attending a public lecture after all. So this is a counterintuitive consequence, to be sure. It's at odds with our ordinary way of like talking about stuff. If I asked you like, hey, do you know whether anybody here is in a public lecture? You'd probably say, yeah, like all of us are, right? But this argument kind of suggests that's wrong. So here's a reaction that a lot of people have this kind of argument. I mean, there's a real puzzle here. It's like hard to see kind of why exactly this argument is wrong. There are deep epistemological puzzles about it, but many people are just convinced that it must be wrong. And moreover, that like, it's kind of cute, but it's like really removed from reality. So, I teach this stuff all the time, and I always have, 10% of my students are like, I mean, come on, John. Do we really have to think about stuff like this? And I give them the talk I'm giving you. So, all right. So, and like the first bit of that talk is, like, remember how we got here. We got here from this very common sense point that, like, you shouldn't just believe everything that pops into your head. That, like, sometimes stuff's wrong, and we need to have standards for belief. And so, Descartes, like, articulates a possible standard that you might have. Beliefs that you can have are the ones that, like, you can prove in this particularly satisfying way. And, that's a standard that, like, has some intuitive force to it. It turns out it's probably like going to make things pretty hard to really stick with that standard. But like you can see how we got here. And actually, if you want to like argue that we should have a different standard, then like cases like the brain in that case like might be part of that explanation for like why you should convince yourselves to do it. All right, so that's like part of why I think the far-fetched skeptical scenarios have their place. But I also want to like say something a little bit more concessive to my frustrated student, and that's that there's lots of like less far-fetched versions of these cases that are worth talking about too. So we can have versions of skeptical scenarios that have this form that are much sort of closer to our ordinary experience with kind of thinking things through and deciding what to believe. So I mean, here's an argument that you might consider. Experts tell you that like vaccines are safe to give children, but like, hey, can you prove that those experts aren't kind of part of a well-funded conspiracy by the global pharmaceutical industry that's like trying to push these push these vaccines like beyond what safety really commends? Well, I mean, you could try, and I mean, I'm not sure you couldn't do it, but here's something that I'm sure it would take like a lot of work to actually prove that. I've looked a little bit at this kind of evidence. I mean, I'm totally convinced that the conspiracy theory is not true. Can you be a vaxxer, or you have to be like an anti-vaxxer? I'm an anti-vaxxer anyway. But it's not because like I know how to defeat their arguments, because I actually don't. Like the science is just a little too complicated for me, and I haven't like studied epidemiology in the way that would be necessary. Anyway, that was an autobiographical fact about what arguments I know how to refute. What I was really trying to do was set up a skeptical argument here, right? So here's a skeptical argument. Oh yeah, you think vaccines are safe, but like here's a way you can imagine things being. Vaccines aren't safe, but all the doctors are part of this like conspiracy to make you think they are. So like unless you can prove that that's wrong, like you don't know that vaccines are safe. Right? That's an argument. That's an argument that like lots of people approximately endorse. This is an argument that is like a serious social force in the world. I think the practical import of this argument is pretty obvious. This, I think, is an example of a bad argument. Like I say, I'm an anti-vaxxer. But there are also plenty of like good arguments that have this form, right? Some things you really shouldn't trust because you can't rule out like the bad possibilities. So there's nothing kind of inherently far-fetched or impractical about the idea of skeptical scenarios. The extreme versions that philosophers often like spend more of their time focusing on represent like only one piece of like the picture here, and I think of them as continuous with this whole project. The big project is we got to figure out what to think, and we don't like we can't be sort of too gullible. You can't believe just everything. So we need to like figure out some appropriate standards for our beliefs. That's a good project. That's a necessary project. And that's in significant part what the project of epistemology is. All right. So that's a good project, I say. The project of having some standards for belief, for not being too gullible. I chose my sentence carefully a second ago. I said that's part of what epistemology is. Sometimes you'll hear people say that like that's kind of what epistemology is. This project of like making sure that your beliefs stand up to scrutiny. That's the part that like gets most focused on. I think of this as the negative part of epistemology. That label will give you a clue for what I think's missing from it. So according to negative epistemology, and this is like really mainstream stuff. This is like what a lot of people spend most of their time on when they're doing epistemology. They are cautioning you not to be too hasty in forming beliefs. So that bit of Descartes I started with. I need to like, I've been wrong sometimes in the past. So here's my strategy for like reacting to that. I'm going to start by like getting rid of all my beliefs and then examine them like one by one and only bring back the ones that I'm sure are good enough. And there are various kind of more specific things you can get here. You might have a knowledge norm of belief that says you should only believe things if you know them. The exact details are of course controversial. But lots and lots of epistemic norms are formulated in this negative way. Don't believe things unless some circumstance is met, right? This, I think, connects to some of our like stereotypes about rationality. So if you think about, what is it to be like a very rational person? I I think it's part of the stereotype of rationality in the popular imagination that one is like very reflective, one is contemplative, one is sitting, and that's often like that's often part of the story. So you're not rushing to judgment, you're being slow to judgment. What are the contrasts with being rational? Well, rational, what's that the opposite of? Well, irrational because you're clever, but, emotional, right? Rationality and emotion are like this kind of very tropey dichotomy, right? If you look at Rodin's thinker here, like I mentioned, he's sitting, and I think that's not an accident. I think it's part of the stereotype of rationality that you're pretty inactive. Rationality is about thinking. It's not about doing stuff. It's about being really sure, right? And I think that negative epistemology really kind of reinforces this stereotype. And as you might be guessing from my way of setting this up, I think we're missing out on something important. And actually, I call this a positive alternative. I wish I hadn't. I don't like the word alternative here because I think we need to do both things. But here's the positive half of the story. It's true that you should not be too skeptical. It's true that you should only believe stuff when your evidence is enough to support belief. I agree with that, but I also think that you should not be too skeptical. You shouldn't be too gullible. You also shouldn't be too skeptical. You shouldn't suspend judgment when the evidence tells you what to believe. It can be a mistake to fail to form a belief, just like it can be a mistake to form a belief. And I've just given some examples in the slides here of kinds of norms that you might imagine along those lines. Much less of epistemology talks about norms like these. There's a little bit that you'll see, but I mean, just to give you a sense of how different this is from some of the archetypes. So I started with Descartes. I've been wrong about things in the past, so here's my new project. I'm gonna get rid of all my beliefs and examine them one by one and only hold on to the really good ones. Here's a bizarro Descartes one could imagine. So many years ago, I realized there have been many important facts of which I remain totally ignorant. This led to a distorted and incomplete understanding of the world. So I resolved to accept all the opinions available until I found reason to doubt them. I'm not saying this is a good idea. This is not a good strategy. But here's something I really do think. I think this strategy is no worse than the Descartes strategy. Descartes' strategy was, I'm going to get rid of everything and examine things one by one and bring it back. That's a reasonable thing to do in response to one half of the epistemological problem, the problem of forming too many beliefs, forming beliefs that you shouldn't. But because I think there's such a thing as not forming enough beliefs, we need to put some pressure on the other side too. So we shouldn't do something like this project. I'm not saying everyone should believe everything, but we should be looking for something that's more intermediate between these two extremes than epistemology tends to look at. So I said you don't see this a lot in epistemology. There are a few places. Some of you, if you've been around epistemology a while, some of you are probably thinking about William James right now. So William James kind of famously describes two fundamental epistemic duties: the duty to believe the truth and the duty to avoid falsehood. I think this is, more or less right. Quibble exactly about what the duties are, but a positive duty and a negative duty. And my point is, in a lot of thought about this, both within analytic epistemology and within just kind of the popular imagination or stereotypes about rationality, I think duty number one here tends to get short shrift. Here's Henri Poincaré. To doubt everything or to believe everything are two equally convenient solutions, and they're both bad. They both dispense with the necessity of reflection. That's another statement of the kind of call for balance that I'm after here. And one more quote, just because 3 is a good number. Here's Carl Sagan. Famous skeptic, right? Famous skeptic Carl Sagan. But here he's emphasizing the need for positive norms too. If you're only skeptical, then no new ideas make it through to you. You never learned anything new. You become a crotchety old person convinced that nonsense is ruling the world. But every now and then, a new idea turns out to be good. If you're too much in the habit of being skeptical about everything, you're going to miss it or resent it. And either way, you'll be standing in in the way of understanding and progress. So I think this is right. So all of those authors I just mentioned are emphasizing the need for both sides here, and that's my project too. Positive norms as well as negative norms. I'm spending my time here defending the positive norms because I think those are the ones that get overlooked. But don't take away the idea that Jonathan thinks like there are no negative norms and it's okay to believe anything. I definitely don't think that. But I do think that we could do with some further emphasis on the importance of positive norms. All right. That's my that's the part of my talk that's kind of more comfortably at home in traditional analytic epistemology. I'm going to start getting political now. I want to suggest that there's a connection between the emphasis on the skeptical and a bias toward the conservative. Conservative is one of these words that gets used in a lot of different ways. I'm using it in its kind of anti-reform sense. So by conservative, I don't mean like you like small government. I mean you don't like changing the social order. That's what I mean by conservative here. Okay. And the way that I'm going to draw this connection is through the connection that I mentioned near the beginning between epistemology and action. So I started out by saying epistemology has a lot to do with decision making. You have to act on reasons, and your reasons should be things you know or things that are well supported by your evidence, something like that. And just for precision's sake, here's something that I do think what you should do. I'm a knowledge person. I think what you should do depends on what you know. I also think, and this doesn't follow like deductively, but it's not surprising if you think that. What you are likely to do depends a lot on what you take yourself to know, because I think you're, trying to live up to some kind of norm like this, right? So what that means, pretty straightforwardly, is the pressure towards skepticism just is going to be, ipso facto, pressure against action. The thought is, to do something, you have to be doing it for reasons. And reasons are like the kinds of things that are, well supported epistemically speaking. And so if you're impressed by skepticism, and if you're thinking, and I don't just mean radical skepticism, not just saying if you think you're brain bad. I mean if you're impressed by the skeptical considerations with respect to the particular question that you're thinking about, maybe including relatively modest everyday skeptical scenarios, then those considerations are going to be considerations that make you less likely to do the thing. That is to say, they're considerations that are going to make you more likely to sit tight and exist as part of a society where the status quo is the way it is. And I think that actually, this is one of my this is one of my political opinions, I guess. But I think sitting tight in a society that has certain features is, in at least a wide variety of cases, tantamount to tacitly contributing to society having those features. I think that when we, particularly, I'm going to go on to talk about oppressive features, standing by and, acting like it's okay is a way of making that something that's normalized within your society. So I think that there's a fairly robust sense in which skeptical pressure can make you support the status quo. And you see this in some discussions of skeptical considerations sometimes. Here's Sextus Empiricus, ancient Greek Pyrrhonian skeptic. He writes, so he's describing kind of the way that his kind of skeptics live. Adhering to appearances, we live in accordance with the normal rules of life. He's reacting to this idea that, if you're a skeptic, then you're just going to sit there and not do anything and starve to death, right? This is an objection people gave against the ancient skeptics. And Sextus said, no. We don't just sit there and not do anything. We just kind of do the normal thing. We live in accordance with the normal rules of life. We do it undogmatically, but you can't sit there and starve to death. You have to go with the flow. And it would seem the regulation of life is fourfold, and he mentions four considerations. The one that's relevant for my purposes here is he explicitly mentions the tradition of laws and customs. So yeah, if you don't know what's true, you got to do something. so you should just like, do what the people around you are doing. That's a very explicit, I think, connection between skepticism and the kind of conservatism that I'm describing. Skip forward a couple of millennia. Here's David Hume. David Hume famously has arguments against the rationality of our reliance on inductive reasoning, assuming that, recognizing cause and effect, assuming that that things have gone this way a million times before means they're probably going to go this way again. He has this nice skeptical argument that shows there's no real rationality behind that kind of assumption. But like Sextus, he doesn't say that you should stop eating, or that it's that you should be indifferent to whether you drink the water or whether you drink the poison, because neither one is something that you have any reason to believe will make things better or worse. He does think you don't have reason to believe that either one will make you better or worse. But he doesn't suggest living like that. He says what you should do, it's quite like Sextus here, says, you can get all worked up about it when you're doing philosophy all the time, but don't spend all your time doing philosophy. Sometimes just let the carelessness and inattention, how do I want to describe this? No, there's no good way to finish that sentence. Sometimes be careless and inattentive and, just kind of do what comes naturally to you. And, that's basically all humans can do anyway. So that's my advice. That's more or less what Hume says here. Here's my thought. Carelessness and inattention and going along with the way things seem naturally to you, those seem pretty good ways to acquiesce to the status quo. They seem like pretty terrible ways to reform society. There are exceptions here, of course. Sometimes skepticism amounts to the recognition of further possibilities that you might not have been able to see before, and that can inspire reform. That's a possible thing as well. We got some weird stuff going on over there. All right. I recommend carelessness and inattention with respect to those noises in the back room. Right. Last year, Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. Lots of you will have heard about this. This was big news. Jamal Khashoggi was a Saudi author, a critic of the government, very brutally and the details are grisly and awful. But murdered in a Saudi embassy or consulate or one of those things, and all the best intelligence seems to suggest that it was the Saudi government that did it, probably at the order of, definitely with the knowledge of the Saudi crown prince, who's tight with the Trump administration. So lots of people were kind of making a big fuss about that. Here's Donald Trump's statement on the matter. I won't read you this whole thing, but what he says kind of near the beginning is, oh yeah, lots of people thought this guy was bad, but still, Khashoggi. But, it's bad that he was murdered. I'm against Khashoggi's murder, says Donald Trump. But here's what I want to focus on. Our intelligence agencies continue to assess all information. It could be the Crown Prince had knowledge. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. We're probably just never going to know what really happened. And, our arms deals with the Saudis, there's a lot of money there, right? And, we've got this military interest with Iran. It'd just be it'd be really disruptive to know that the Crown Prince is assassinating U.S. people, or dissidents generally, under these kinds of circumstances. So let's just not kind of do anything. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what this says, right? This is another example of a way in which skeptical rhetoric. Oh, maybe did, maybe didn't. We're investigating the situation. That kind of makes it sound like if you read this kind of, if you skim it over, like this has a little bit of the like veneer of rationality. Oh, you know, we're investigating. It's just really hard to know what happened. We'll just keep like, you know, sitting and thinking and be contemplative about it. But let's not do anything rash. Let's not like undermine our arms deals, right? It's another example of this kind of move. Here's a really different kind of example. Earlier this year, a trans woman in philosophy wrote this really heartbreaking anonymous essay about her experience dealing with transphobia in philosophy and explaining why she feels like she needs to leave the discipline and so left. So drawing attention to some of the harms of transphobic cultural, transphobic rhetoric in philosophy. I want to say a blogger, but no, I gotta cite my sources. So a blogger called Brian Leiter wrote this response, this description of this piece. There's lots of things one could say about it, but the thing that I want to emphasize is the raising a doubt about like whether this really is like a real philosophy student, a real trans woman. So this is by someone claiming to be a graduate student. Maybe she is, maybe not. This is another way, I think, to make it easier to not believe something it would be inconvenient to believe. It would take a lot of, it would be disruptive to believe that like academic philosophy has a serious transphobia problem. And so we have good reason, I think, not good reason. We have understandable psychological motivation to find ways of resisting that. And I think that's part of what's going on here. Here's Charles Mills discussing skepticism as it connects to oppression in a way like a little bit similar to what I'm up to, but certainly he has a different focus. So Mills is discussing, this is a fairly old piece, it's in the early 90s, but he's discussing why, he's hypothesizing as to why people of color have been less attracted to certain bits of like analytic epistemology. And he suggests the focus on radical skepticism might have something to do with it. The way he puts it here is, the subordinated are in no position to doubt the existence of other people, especially that of their oppressors. That will seem frivolous, a mark of social privilege. So I think there's something to this. Again, like I hope I was clear earlier. Like I think these skeptical scenarios have their place. I think they're there for a good reason. I think they're worth talking about. But I certainly think there's something to the idea that which kinds of questions can you take seriously? Can you take to be the animating ones, the ones that are worthy of more of our focus? Has a lot more to do with our practical interests than like the stereotype of a fully kind of objective, removed, rational epistemology might suggest. So really, these transitions between sections are all pretty gradual. I've been talking about oppression already, but I'd like to focus more specifically on the connection between skepticism and oppression, and I will start focusing now on rape culture, which is promised in the title. So here's a thought experiment. This is a thought experiment in the literal sense. It's a short fictional work that I have written for the purpose of a philosophical illustration. It contains proper names that are non-referring proper names. These are fictional characters described in my thought experiment. You will recognize, I suspect, this thought experiment as realistic. Here's a secret. The way that I made this thought experiment is I took something that really happened and I changed some names. But anyway, here's my thought experiment. Professor Vine, a name I made up, excuse me, is a prominent philosophy professor and the subject of numerous sexual harassment and assault complaints by former students and employees. These complaints are widely known about. They've been published in the national, international press. I want to focus on the position of people who have read about this story, but don't have special first-hand knowledge. So I'm not talking about people who were there when Professor Vine was groping his students. or people who are doing the investigations at the university. I'm talking about people who read about these reports in the newspaper and talk about them with their colleagues, right? If you're even remotely like me, you've been in the position of the kinds of people that I'm talking about here many times over the past many years. So, in a case like this, people like us, let's imagine, face various practical questions that have epistemological, that depend on epistemological assumptions, or that depend on epistemological questions. So here are some examples of the kinds of practical questions that I'm considering. You might be a student who, would have been interested in taking one of Professor Vine's courses, but now you might think, oh, like, I've heard some bad stories about this guy. Maybe that would be, like, unsafe for me to, like, go take that course. That's a deliberative situation that I think it's not hard to imagine being in. Maybe you're Professor Vine's colleague. So, with lots of my colleagues, I do stuff like, invite them to my workshops to give talks at my events. But maybe I've heard these stories about Professor Vine, and I think, well, he works on like the stuff that like my event's about, but on the other hand, I've heard all these stories, and like maybe if I invite him to my thing, maybe I'm putting like my people at risk. Maybe I'm, by visibly doing that, maybe I'm contributing to the normalization of this kind of behavior that he's been accused of. These are the kinds of considerations that people like me would have. You might be an administrator at Professor Vine's university, in which case you might have questions to consider about disciplinary matters, suspending his courses, revoking his tenure, terminating his employment, etc. Right? These are all, I think, questions that turn one way or another on epistemic questions, as well as moral questions. Certainly that's true. But these are examples, I think, I think the moral questions, well, many of the moral questions are not too hard to answer in a case like this. I mean, take it we think sexual assault is bad, right? But how to react to these kinds of situations, given the evidential situation that I've stipulated, can really pull out some epistemological questions that people are going to have a hard time with. And I would like to really set this up along the model of clashes of epistemic intuitions, like the ones that traditional abstract epistemology often trades in. So I mean, here is, I think, what is literally a pair of conflicting epistemic intuitions that we can think about here. You might have somebody like this blue character, kind of green on this projector, I guess, who says, I know that Professor Vine has harassed a bunch of his students because, I heard their testimony as reported in the national press, right? But you might also have somebody who says something like this red character. There's no way for anybody to know what happened if they weren't there themselves, right? That's a thing that you'll hear people saying. In cases like the Professor Vine case, if you talk to people about them, you're going to hear people saying both of these things. This is a very normal kind of disagreement that people will have about the Professor Vine situation. And, this is probably obvious, but like just to be really clear, I think that this has, very much the same kind of structure as some of the puzzles that, fall under the heading of like a skeptical paradox sometimes. This is a lot like somebody saying, oh yeah, I know I have hands, and somebody else saying, look, there's no way for anybody to know whether or not they're a brain in a vat. We're talking about different skeptical scenarios. We're talking about the employment of different kinds of standards. These are both kinds of cases where one person is affirming knowledge, someone else is denying knowledge, and each stance has a certain kind of intuitive force behind it. At least, many will agree so in both of these kinds of cases. So if you are, if you're like the blue person, the green person, I should say, if you're like the green person here, who thinks that we can know that Professor Vine has engaged in serious misconduct, then what kinds of things might you say against the red person who says there's no way to know unless you're there yourself? Well, you might just think about the epistemology of testimony, right? Generally speaking, most of us who are not quite skeptical think that there's a lot of testimonial knowledge. That is to say, quite often we can know things by being told them. There's just lots of stuff that I know without having seen it myself. That's a very common sense thought. It's also something that just about every epistemologist who writes about testimony thinks. So I mean, Boris Johnson's the prime minister, right? Like right now, that's something I know. I didn't like see that happen. I've never seen Boris Johnson, right? I know that because I read about it in the newspaper. So here's a thought, like, hey, maybe I know that Professor Vine like harasses students because I read about that in the newspaper too. Yeah, there are differences, obviously, but that's a kind of consideration one might press. We are, of course, not always trusting. This is the familiar point again about needing to be discriminating about our epistemic situation. It does seem like a psychological fact that when you bump into allegations of the sort we're engaging with respect to Professor Vine, people tend to be less kind of default accepting than they do with like lots of testimony. That seems true. Is there a good reason for that? Well, I mean, there's a good epistemological discussion to be had about that question. One idea that comes up pretty often is that this is a high stakes situation, and so because it's it's really damaging to be accused of sexual misconduct, and so you should use high evidential standards for acceptance in order to match the high stakes of the situation. I think a thought here is something like you should be extra careful in cases where it's really important. So I have some problems with this stance here. One of the problems is that I think focusing just on the stakes like for Professor Vine is distorting here. There are many more people than just him who are involved in the situation, and this is a high stakes situation for all of them. So focusing just on the harm that might be done to Vine by making a certain decision doesn't kind of give full justice to the momentousness of the decision that's faced in these kinds of cases. But I also have sort of a more theoretical concern, and it has to do with the balance that I was talking about earlier between positive and negative epistemology. So here I think is the stakes thought, the thought that might be used to try to justify having higher standards here. And the thought is, well, if it's a really important question, then you should be extra careful. And what I mean by extra careful is you should be more reluctant to form beliefs. You should suspend judgment. This, I think, is a mistake. And it's a mistake for the reason I was talking about earlier. It's a mistake because it assumes that there's no such thing as the mistake of suspending judgment when you shouldn't have. But that is a thing. And a way to make the point, in this kind of more morally weighted context, is to say, look, suspending judgment is only the safe thing to do if there's no potential downside to remaining ignorant. But that's not always the case. That's the case roughly when the status quo is basically fine. When the only thing you have to worry about is whether you're gonna form a bad judgment and mess things up. If we're alive to the possibility that the status quo is not fine, if, for example, Professor Vine's out there sexually harassing his students, then skepticism toward his survivors is actively harmful. This, I think, is is an aspect of rape culture. Rape culture is the name for the features of society that make society conducive to sexual assault. It includes, things like victim-blaming tropes, but it also includes things like using higher standards for accepting the testimony of people reporting sexual misconduct. It does that because those higher standards correspond to making it more difficult to prevent people from this bad behavior, which is another way of saying making it more easier for this bad behavior to happen. Those conflicting epistemic intuitions that I was discussing, I think, fairly straightforwardly connect to these practical kinds of stances. This is because, as I've been saying all along, epistemology and the practical are deeply connected. That blue person that green person who's saying things like, I know that Professor Vine has harassed students, that's the kind of thing you say when you're motivating a more proactive response to those practical questions. And if you're the kind of person who says, you can't really know what happened if you weren't there yourself, that's the kind of thing that you say if you're trying to shut down the idea of an active response. rape culture is a structural phenomenon. Rape culture, as the name suggests, right? It's part of culture. It's not something that lives in like individuals' heads, and individuals contribute to it, of course, because they're part of society. But they're also dramatically affected by it. These kinds of tropes that I'm describing that make certain kinds of courses natural, that make certain sorts of interests the ones that naturally attract our sympathy, are part of rape culture, but they also contribute to rape culture by kind of pushing us in that kind of direction. When you are faced with a sexual assault report, especially one against someone who's in a socially powerful position, the kinds of aspects of rape culture that like tend to come out include things like challenges to credibility, so focusing on the history of this person, is this is the need for a perfect victim, that kind of trope. Something that I think is very epistemically important is a tendency to focus on context-free details. So like just zoom in to exactly what was happening in that moment, and can you explain what went wrong and like why was that like not consent under these kinds of circumstances, without thinking about kind of the broader structural patterns that people are living in. There are more things to say, but I'm going a little long, so I think I will skip past that a little bit. Let me talk instead, slightly more generally now, about Catherine Hundleby's idea of a status quo fallacy. The status quo fallacy, according to Hundleby, and I like this idea, is roughly the kind of default assumption that things are basically fine. I think it's a way of kind of articulating a lot of this kind of bias toward the negative within epistemology that I've been describing. Hundleby suggests, and I think that she's right, that it's a good idea to think of this fallacy like alongside other kinds of informal fallacies, the kind that you get in your informal reasoning courses. You can think about affirming the consequent, you can think about like the genetic fallacy, you can think about the status quo fallacy. I think this is fairly robust. In the particular context that I'm at here, I'm pointing to ways in which denying knowledge can be part of a self-reinforcing mechanism for oppressive structures. And often this is going to happen pretty subpersonally. Like I was saying earlier, part of what makes these structural features so insidious is that they kind of like, they just feel like objectivity. This is the way that like it's normal for things to be. And again, it's contrast with like being emotional and thinking about these things. So a lot of this can happen, very subconsciously. As I put it here, reflexive deference to power. It can also be more individually motivated in like ways that I think are quite complicated with respect to culpability. Here's an anecdote. This is a true story that happened to my friend, who's given me permission to tell this story in these kinds of contexts. So my friend was sexually assaulted by her academic mentor. She was very close both to him and to his wife, and after some time, my friend told the wife about what had happened. And the wife kind of listened and thought for a minute, and then said back to my friend, if I were to believe you, that would destroy my marriage. Which is infuriating and heartbreaking, but like, I sort of see how that happens. I mean, the surprising thing is that she's like kind of self-aware in that, like, she's like halfway self-aware there. But this is just a stark example of this thing I was mentioning earlier, where like some things are just really disruptive to believe, and when there's kind of wiggle room, when you're like within the epistemological gray area, that's going to make you much likelier to go in that kind of direction. Let's see here. I was going to talk about John Furlong and UBC, but I see that I've been going for an hour, so I'd better skip that and just remind you of what I've already said. I've said enough things. So here's what I've said. I have focused on respects in which I think epistemological questions are practical questions. I'm trying to, and kind of in service of that point, I tried to suggest there's something of a continuum and strong parallels between the kind of radical skeptical scenarios that are sort of involved in our stereotypes of analytic epistemology and much more ordinary things that are much more obviously practically relevant. I've tried to suggest that our rationality stereotypes, buttressed by certain negative emphasis in epistemology, tends to make us miss out on the importance of positive epistemic norms. And I've suggested that that tendency, the bias toward the skeptical, can also, in important cases, contribute toward against attempts at reform that's connected to conservatism, and in the particular case when the status quo involves oppressive features, that amounts to a kind of reinforcement of those bad oppressive features. So that's a kind of connection between morality and politics and skepticism that I think epistemologists would be wise to pay more attention to. Thank you for your attention.